Everyone to World Building Wednesday. We are back. Microphone is on. Excuse me, is on. There we go. Whoops. Turn off the audio over there so you're not hearing me twice. And let's talk about world building. So last week we went over some basic principles. The idea that the purpose of your setting will inform certain parameters, certain things that you can or can't do with your world, right? So if you're designing for a video game, that might require certain things out of your world. And then we moved into, excuse me, the question of tech level, i.e. how technologically advanced is your setting. And this is a little complicated because we can imagine many different paths of how technology can advance. But as I related, an easy way of thinking about that is with the society's relationship to metal. How advanced is metallurgy in this world? And that really has a lot of fundamental impacts on what the world is and how the world can be. So we said you can be Stone Age, which has basically no use of metals. Bronze Age, using soft metals. Iron and steel, kind of like medieval era. Gunpowder age, mechanical age, industrial age, so forth and so on. Then we talked about food. How do people get food? This is a pretty fundamental question, and it determines a lot of things about the setting, and we'll see about that here in a minute. Let's go and review the settings we came up with. So we had the first setting, which is a Bronze Age world, where the only metals available are relatively soft. Iron is known but expensive and rare, and most cooking is done with earthenware and some copper brass. Let's flesh that out a little bit and say that weapons are mostly bronze with a few rare iron weapons. That makes sense. Just kind of define that. And we'll also say, because of this, chariots and other animal-drawn what we call them, carts and such, are commonplace. So people know how to, with those sorts of metals, you can absolutely build those sorts of things. And that actually ties into the other thing. Food is plentiful. About half of all food is farmed or ranched, while the other half is gathered from the dense foliage of the world. So there's lots of fruit trees and bushes with berries on them and things along those lines. You can just grab and eat a lot of edible foliage as well. It's common to grab food from the environment, which assumes clear distinctions between public and private property. Food on the border of a property is public, and it's seen as a public good. So you will allow food on the side of your property to be gathered by people passing by, and that's considered virtuous to do. People rarely venture into less verdant areas. So this means herbivores are plentiful, especially in remote areas, and thus carnivores are also plentiful. Many herbivores are used as beasts of burden. So because we have this ability to use metal, and we can create carts, and we have all these herbivores around eating all of this verdant foliage and such, naturally those are going to be tamed and used for beasts of burden, drawing carts and plowing fields and such like that. Setting 2, gunpowder is arriving. So ore is very common, a lot of volcanoes around, so there's less verdant countryside. In other words, this is a somewhat more rocky world, an area with somewhat less foliage. Iron is extremely commonplace, and steel commonplace but relatively expensive. About 3/4 of cooking equipment is iron. Modern armies are training with muskets and cannons rather than swords and spears. And by that we mean that if your army does not use muskets and cannons, you're considered backwards. There are some relatively backwards countries that are doing that, but everyone kind of knows that they're not going to survive very long. And some gunpowder-based machinery is being experimented with, so not just weapons of war, but like we said, I think before, basically simple pistons and other machines based on chemical reaction. Steam engines are also practical, but not, well, steam engines have been constructed but they're not practical. In fact, we'll say that. Explode, but they cannot yet be built small enough to be practical beyond locomotive scale machinery. So you can build something like a locomotive. I haven't decided yet whether we're going to have actual locomotives. One of the reasons why you have, by the way, locomotives instead of free cars, why wouldn't you just have a steam engine that's not on a track, is because they're so incredibly heavy they'll get bogged down immediately. A track for a steam engine is not just on rails, it is also made of very hard packed earth and gravel. The ground underneath that is built up to be very, 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 very firm. And then you have the rails on top of that to kind of keep it where it is. So it's the heaviness that's the main issue there. Then ranching is the default food method. Most people grow up on ranches, growing and butchering domesticated animals. They've been bred for many centuries for this express purpose, and there are over a dozen different food animals, just straight up food animals. Think like chickens are now. Some of these animals are barely conscious, having been bred into extreme stupidity, so no intelligence whatsoever. And in fact, we'll say some people will only eat these animals. So a form of vegetarianism. There are vast tracts of land, and people generally live in large groups on shared ranches. People generally travel large distances. There are multiple mountain pack animals. So another way I want to kind of differentiate this is that we're going to have a lot of animals here, but I think they're going to be much more well known and bred, and it's going to be the kind of world where you're much more aware of what those fauna are, as opposed to setting one where there can be lots of wild animals and weird animals out in the wilderness that no one really knows what's going on out there. Some folks may have ventured out and cataloged a few, but it's much more mysterious than it is in setting two, which would be much more domesticated. All right, so let's move on, besides those things, to other elements of our setting. And the next thing I want to talk about, actually two things tonight, are magic and property. And while interrelated, one is not necessarily dependent on the other, so I think I'm going to start first with magic. So what are the main questions to ask about magic? Well, first off, as with the other one, magic is partly defined by your purpose. So if you're making a video game where the player's character or characters will be using magic, then that magic has to be very carefully defined. It will have very specific effects because you want the player to have control. You can't just have magic do whatever you want because you have to program all that into the video game. Whereas for a novel, you can be, if not necessarily loosey-goosey, you can leave vast amounts of magic kind of unexplored. And you can have the main character use magic in unexpected ways because magic can be kind of magic. So a few questions to ask there. How magic is magic? Meaning, is magic in your society basically a science with known rules, and where sometimes people are on the extreme edge of those rules, but everyone knows if you do these things in this order, this thing always happens. And is that written down? Is it practical? Is it repeatable? So, is it repeatable? Now, you don't necessarily want a magic that is completely random, but you can certainly have magic that doesn't always work out exactly as the caster intends. So, for example, it may be that magic works pretty much how you expect, but it may be much more powerful than you think. It may be very hard to control for the caster, in other words. So that's a question. The other question is, how powerful is magic? What can you do? Can a single spellcaster level a mountain if sufficiently powerful? Or is it more like, say, Dresden Files, where I guess you could technically do that, but the general level of magic is much lower? That's an important consideration. Then you get into the question of, I'm going to call them drawbacks. In other words, what does magic cost? So if you have a magic system and you're just casting spells, can you just cast spells all day, every day, and never tire out? Or is there some cost to that? Do you need to consume resources? What resources need to be consumed, right? So we'll say resource drains. Oops, drains. This is very, very important and can fundamentally, excuse me, fundamentally flavor your world in very strong ways. For example, in one fantasy world I know of, all magic requires sacrifice. It requires blood to be sacrificed. So you may, cut your arm and lose a significant amount of blood to do a very minor spell. You may sacrifice a dove to do a more powerful spell. And it works all the way up there like human sacrifice. And you can do human sacrifice, and that will do an incredibly powerful spell, but people generally frown on such things, right? And that creates some very interesting socio-political ramifications in terms of what spells are allowed and what are what kind of things does society frown on. Especially if magic is useful, then you might see a society that absolutely allows this and has animals, bred for sacrifice, which then gets into the question of, is that really a sacrifice anymore, right? You might find in that society, for example, that if the whole point of the sacrifice is that it has to be a sacrifice, but society has made that trivial, and you can sacrifice that bird really, really cheaply, the magic might start to fail or weaken because it's not a sacrifice anymore. So what are those limitations, if you will, on magic, and what does it do in your society? And then, so we'll say costs and resource drains. I think that's a little more straightforward. And then we'll say, actually we'll put this in here in the middle as well. Limitations are the hard limitations on magic. So for example, you may have a world in which you can cast illusions, you can interact with the elements and so forth and so on, but you could not, there are no psionic powers. Or maybe there's only illusion magic, and you are basically tricking people with all of these spells, but you cannot literally light something on fire, right? Or reshape a river. It is all just making people think things are happening. And that has some very interesting potentials because, again, you're not actually changing the world, you're just changing what other people think the world is. And that can be, in some senses, as powerful as actual world-shaping magic, but it will also be very tightly controlled. I'm sorry, there's something in my throat. I have not talked much today, so apparently throat is having problems. Okay, so that is that. And those are some of the things to think about with magic, is how weird is it, basically? Is it repeatable? How powerful is it? How far can it scale up? How far are you willing to have it scaled up? What are its hard limitations, and what are their costs to the people actually casting that magic? And you can also start talking about fundamental how do people interact with magic / cast a spell? In other words, is this something completely innate where you just think about it and it happens? Do you have to draw blood? Do you have to draw a chalk circle on the ground? All these various things. Or is any of that possible? I should also point out, a lot of people will say, well, maybe all of that is possible. That's fine, but then you have to figure out which of those are actually going to work in your story, in your game, whatever. Right? Just saying all that is possible doesn't really help you much. Just like saying any particular person might exist, you need to define who your characters are, and thus you need to define how your magic works. And you can leave that to say, maybe there is somebody out there who can cast magic using chalk circles, but for my characters and what I'm, focusing on here, it is this particular thing. So those are the main things when I think about magic. So let's think about that in terms of our worlds and our settings. Is that how we did it before, or did we go through the other options? Let's go through the other options, I think. Let's talk about our two other topics, and then we'll focus on those on the flip side. So I need to add another heading for property. Rather different topic, but important. And again, fundamental to your setting. How do people see property? We've already seen this crop up in one of the settings. The way food is so available means that property questions become a little more complicated because you may enclose a resource, a food resource. And this may seem very obvious. Everyone knows how property is handled. Well, property is handled very differently in different cultures. There are maybe things that you technically, that you are in possession of, but you do not have absolute ownership of, that you are essentially a steward of for the next generation. So, for example, you might have a family weapon, right? The family sword in the classic sense, where, yes, you technically own that and can do whatever you want with it, but it is also a family heirloom that is meant to be passed down from generation to generation because it is a very expensive item and something that, your kid may not be able to afford, but now that somebody has been able to buy it in your family, it makes a lot more sense to pass that down from one person to another, which can build up an actual legal status for those things of saying you cannot sell that item unless in specific circumstances. And indeed, the law of the land might require that because, for example, in medieval Europe, in certain places and times, every family was required to own a weapon, so that brigands and lawbreakers could be swiftly brought to justice by sort of mustering the townspeople to fight those things off. Which meant further that you couldn't just sell your weapon or without saying, well, I already have this other weapon, here. I have multiple weapons. I can sell the one. But if you then went and said, I'm just going to sell the weapon, and someone is going to say, well, that's the only weapon you have to have one. What are you doing, right? And you could be brought to court for that. So, what is property? So we can go in a couple of different extremes. We can go with a high private property world where you either own something or something is either owned by a person or owned by nobody. And ownership is kind of a default, if you will, where you're either not owned or you're owned by one particular person and that's it. Most modern societies have that concept at least and operate according to that as a basis, while there's still also public property, obviously. But even in modern society, public property is considered still the property of the state, which has its own, something. In other words, public property is not owned by everyone in the world. It's owned by the government, right? So that is a thing as well. But then you also have kind of public property in the sense of like a public park, where this is a park that is, again, technically owned by the government, but anyone can come here and kind of be on these lands, but that also has restrictions, right? You can't be in a public park at dark or after dark unless you have specific permission to be there, to camp. So there's that. Then, of course, there is no property at all, which can be done but is difficult because resources can then be hogged by individual people, can be overused or abused by one particular person. Then you have things like collectives, where items are owned by everyone in a particular group, excluding everyone outside of that group. That can work. It has some options and some flexibility. This is often a practical reality in modern societies, in the sense of like a house, for example, or the kitchen table, where everyone in the house can use the kitchen table. That is not the sole domain of one person in the house, but there can also be some negotiation around that, right? So, how does the public property work? So let's write some of these things down. All private property, no private property, communal property, no property. Like I said, no property is pretty rare, but it can be done functionally. It's just hard with human nature, right? This is also something I should bring up here, the question of human nature. Often when we're designing fantasy worlds, people say, well, but I'm designing a world that's somewhere, it's not our world. And so these people aren't really humans. So I'm just going to decide they're not greedy. You can totally do that. The difficulty there is that the further away you get them from humans, the harder it is for your audience to understand them without you explaining this, right? So either you need a treatise at the beginning of your work which explains all of these ways in which the characters are different, or you find a really brilliant way of relating that to your audience, or you get a lot of confused viewers, players, what have you. So in this, I'm assuming that the people in this world are functionally identical to, Terran humans of our actual reality. And if you want to go off that reservation, that's fine, but we can't assume they're completely different. Because if they're completely different, then no world building makes sense. You can just invent whatever you want, and nothing has to fit together logically. And the problem with a lack of logic is that it's very hard to follow. So, we're going to assume these people are motivated more or less the way we are. So, generally speaking, you can look at all those various things. Now, property is further complicated by the fact that you can have things owned by multiple people. Marriage is a great example, where in the eyes of the law, the married couple jointly owns things. What does that mean? That is something that your society has to deal with, the question of joint ownership. There's also the question of how legal is ownership. So we will say legal enforcement. Let's put these all under one and then... Okay. So, in other words, often, especially in earlier societies, property was a communally understood thing that might vary from location to location, but wasn't necessarily written down. Nobody had a set of laws in every single village, or every single village didn't have a set of laws laying out what was personal property, what was public property, all that kind of stuff. Everyone just kind of knew. And that was enforced by the local populace and the local sheriff and what have you. So you have to figure out, how universal these concepts of property are. Furthermore, as societies develop, if you will, as societies become more prosperous, as there's more money going around, more free time, things along those lines, there is usually more requirement for legal definition because there is more property to inherit. Inheritance, and that's another thing we should put in here, is one of the things that ends up separating, for lack of a better word, medieval and earlier societies from modern societies, because suddenly you need lawyers and you need a legal system and you need a much more orderly and structured society, a much more stable society for inheritance to actually function. And so that then creates a requirement for a wide variety of jobs, like scribes, lawyers, record keepers, librarians, and a society with enough excess resources to support those people, i.e. you don't need to have everybody farming all the time. Farmers are producing enough food that they can then, support a society that has all these people in it. So inheritance actually becomes a very important thing. What can be passed on from one person to another in inheritance, and what cannot be, what could not be. And that also gets into questions of special classes of ownership. So if somebody builds a house for their family and then wants to pass it on to their children, can they not give the house to their children, even though their children live there? That may be a thing that society decides is not right and not legal, even though that house is technically the person's possession. Okay? So those are all things to think about within your world. All right, so let's start applying these to our settings. So we're starting with our Bronze Age setting with plentiful food and magic. Questions, so do we have magic? I think yes. I think both of these settings will have magic in it to various extents. I think I want this one to have relatively minimal magic, while the more advanced thing I want to have more powerful magic, more a lot of really cool maybe Magitech stuff in that other setting. So we'll say let's see here. Magic is small but controlled. Many people can use simple. Oh, let's use rituals. Use simple rituals to create simple magical effects. Not simple twice. Create. We'll say low power magical effects. There are stories of very powerful wizards, but nobody's ever met one, so to speak. So I think for this we're going to go with like hedge magic, where you can do these simple things to accelerate healing, to what else? Perhaps enhance your hearing, to cause a wind, a simple breeze to blow up in a forest. Perhaps enhance light, cause branches to move aside slightly. Nothing big and world-ending, not big fireball spells, but stuff that is helpful and useful. And I think that's going to be more widespread. Lots of different people can do this. Maybe not necessarily everybody, but you don't need to be one of the very few people born with this power. It's not, 1% of the population can do this. A significant percent, maybe. Do you want it to be like everybody can cast magic? It's a question of whether they do. I think so. Anyone can cast magic if they perform these rituals, though some have innate power that causes stronger effects, that magnifies the spells they cast. All right, so magic is essentially mundane in this world in that sense. It is causing things that cannot be done through raw physics, but it is a very regular, easy to and repeatable thing. Similarly, or separately, some people have a talent for it, a knack for it, or some sort of internal power that can cause that to be more significant. So that is going to be that implies a limitation, i.e., the magic must be feeding off something internal to the person if different people can magnify it. Spells, casting a spell draws out. I don't know if I want to have it draw out life energy. It's just such a cliche. It should certainly be exhaustive to some extent. And I don't want something that transforms you on a fundamental level, right? Like I don't want it to turn you to stone over time, because I know no one would use it. People would not use it commonly. So maybe it is exhaustion. Maybe it is a special kind of energy. So it's not necessarily physical. I don't know. Perhaps mental exhaustion. Let's try that. Taxes the mind. It causes not physical exhaustion, but mental exhaustion. After much magic use, the mind becomes fuzzy, though the body is still physically whole, for lack of a better term. So I like that idea that you're not, you don't have to sit there and rest in the sense that your body is exhausted, you can't run or anything. So you could totally use your body, but your mental faculties are fuzzy. It's like you've been sitting too long and you get up and you're woozy. That works, and it also makes spell casting a little more complicated because spell casting is often done by the more intelligent people, the smarter characters. So the idea that magic messes with your mind is very nice. Actually, let's add something else here. I forgot to mention about magic. Does it involve supernatural creatures? Meaning, does your magic must your magic tap into some other being, whether it be a god or a demon or a fairy or something along those lines, in order to be cast? A lot of magic systems have that idea that you are channeling it through a magical creature, and that has different positive and negative effects. In fact, you could have a very interesting world where, in order to cast magic, you must have a familiar where you cast magic through that familiar. It's actually a fairly common trope in Japanese media, pop media. So you could have kind of a familiar, basically, which is your conduit for magic. That's worth thinking about. I don't think it makes sense for setting 1 because magic is so ubiquitous. Although we might be, we have rituals. No, we won't do it there. We might do it in setting 2. I like that idea for setting 2. So let's go over to setting 2, and we'll say, so magic is, again, rare but powerful. Magic is rare, powerful, and requires a familiar. So magic, to cast magic, you must channel it through a familiar, namely a magical creature. All right. This taps into very powerful magical energies, allowing for dramatic effects. Unfortunately, this is difficult to control. Powerful. What's a good word for? Let's see here. Unsteady. Erratic. Erratic and requires a familiar. Okay, I really like this idea. We've got a magic system that, again, you're not casting the spell. You're casting it through a familiar, and the process of the familiar channeling this magic is not easily controllable. Like it's literally pouring magic through itself, and this might be very powerful or not very powerful. It just kind of depends on a lot of things, and it can also presumably exhaust the creature. I kind of like the idea that in this case, we're literally exhausting the creature. That, like, if you channel too much through the familiar, it dies. Yeah, I think that's going to make sense. I like something a little different than that. Maybe it's something more direct. So it's not just like exhaustion in the sense of feeling tired. Like the familiar is changed somehow, and that change can be reversed, perhaps. What if there's like a dark form of the familiar, and the more you draw on it, the closer it gets to that dark form, and then it can kind of, you can pull it back from that. That's interesting. Let's play around with that. Familiars have two forms, light and dark. They naturally remain in the light state until they cast magic. While they channel magical energy, they slowly transform closer towards their dark state. I don't like the word state. They remain in their light version, maybe? I don't know. I want the idea that this is a spectrum. Over time, the darkness is purged from their body. Perhaps this is this must be manually done. Interesting. Yes, you start with this simple idea. So they start with this sort of pure form. As they channel magic, they are corrupted into a different form, and if you channel enough, and then write that in. If enough energy goes through their body in a short enough time, they are permanently transformed into their dark versions. Yeah. So that's a good limitation. That you can't just keep on doing this over and over and over. Eventually you will desecrate your familiar and turn it just completely dark. But then what is the question? Why couldn't you just keep on pouring energy through? Perhaps that fundamentally changes the magic. Perhaps, yeah, a dark familiar channels energy in a fundamentally different way and rarely serve masters. Okay. So in order to cast magic at all, you need to find a familiar and kind of bond with it. Sort of a Pokemon, Digimon thing. Much more Digimon, actually. Then you can channel magic through that creature. But as you do so, it slowly but surely corrupts that into another form, a dark form. And like as soon as you cast any magic, it gets a little closer to that dark form. And so you then need to purify that familiar to return it to its natural state. If you channel enough through it, the creature permanently transforms into this dark version. And well, in that dark version, it channels just a switch flips inside it, and is now a completely different creature. That's cool. That's interesting. It's a neat kind of weird limitation. And then, of course, you're going to have lots of evil creatures out there that are basically... So all the evil creatures in the world, presumably, or many of them, are dark familiars. Once a familiar is turned dark, they then, no longer will serve you. They go out into the world and become, evil. They're essentially non-controllable anymore. And, in fact, let's just go ahead and say that. Familiar... a dark familiar way. I want some idea that light familiars are generally friendly and positive creatures, while dark familiars are selfish and chaotic. So you're literally changing your familiar's personality. And this adds some really neat stuff. You can imagine this very easily in the anime version, where, you use your familiar, and when the familiar is kind of done casting that spell, they suddenly have a smirk on their face. And they're a little more cocky. And just their personality is shifted a little bit the more you're channeling that magic through them. And you have to kind of purify that out of them. That also creates a very nice dependency, where the familiar has to know at some level that it needs this purging, and there's going to have to be some kind of fundamental concept within the familiar of being willing to go in and have this element of itself purged out. And that also suggests that the familiars aren't that self-aware. They are perhaps intelligent, they are sentient, but they are not too tied to their current personality that they're unwilling to change back into their completely light versions, right? A human would resist changing their personality at that point, whereas a familiar is like, well, no, that just kind of has to happen. So what are familiars? Can you have multiple familiars? Presumably, yes. We'll say that familiars are always possessive and rarely will two serve one spellcaster. And let's use spellcaster instead of master, just because master is a little can be a little icky to some people. All right, so we've got the idea that you could convince multiple familiars to work for you, but you generally only have one. They'll just fight too much. Familiars are generally intelligent and sentient, but may not have human level intelligence. They run a wide gamut from small lizards to humanoid, human-sized creatures. All right, so we're gonna have sprites, little dragons on your shoulder, all the way up to elves, basically, who are right next to you, and you're channeling through. So that's interesting, and you can also have. So the question then is, do you have races of familiars? If you can, if you have let's say like an elf, who you could have as a familiar, is there a separate race of elves who are completely magical, who can cast spells through themselves? Presumably not. Presumably there's a symbiotic relationship here. There needs to be the spellcaster and the familiar. Otherwise, why would the familiars even use the spellcasters? Why would they submit themselves to the spellcaster? So, okay, yes. Let's just make that clear. Familiars cannot cast magic themselves. All right, that solves that problem. That does mean there may be societies of elves, though. So here's another question: could it be a thing where only humans can cast magic? So in other words, how do you avoid a society where people just team up, right? And you have two familiars. One uses the other to cast magic with. Perhaps it doesn't work that way. Perhaps you literally need to be a non-magic person and a spellcaster and a familiar, basically. So yeah, you need to be a non-familiar and a familiar to cast magic. So they need a spellcaster who cannot also be a familiar. Okay. That resolves that weird little logical loop. All right, so there's magic. We haven't even gotten to property yet. Let's figure that out. So let's go back to our food plentiful world with small but controlled magic and talk a bit about property. I'm really excited about that. So property, it feels to me like a society with plentiful food would be relatively independent because you're not dependent on other people for food, and thus would have a stronger sense of personal property. So we'll say that, what are our questions? All private, no private, communal, no property, legal enforcement, and inheritance. So we will say that private property is rigorously enforced. In fact, maybe there's this idea that you have to like mark all your personal property. That it is expected, because there's this abundance, that there's this worry people are going to grab your stuff. So maybe with personal marks, every person has a personal mark or brand that they put on their possessions. This is so the issue is, if you have a highly mobile society, well, we said it's not all that mobile, because you wouldn't want to go into those wild areas with all the herbivores and carnivores stomping around. But I like this idea of the people are very aware that their property is their own. People are very aware of the distinction between personal and public property. Personal mark or brand they put on their possessions. And it is rare to give a possession, this is interesting, as a gift. Instead, you will make one new. Gifts are generally new things, not old things. Family property is also clearly marked with its own symbol. So you can have those things that everyone in the family owns, the family sword, the family house, things along those lines, and those are going to be marked with the family mark, the family crest, basically. And then people are going to have their own things, which has their own name on them, their own little mark on them. And if you're going to give something to somebody, you don't really do hand-me-downs. You don't really do that. You give somebody something, or you would probably, so if this piece of clothing, for example, wears out, or I don't want it anymore, I would probably disassemble, if my mark is on the collar, I would take off the collar, sew a new collar on, and give it to somebody that way. I would give them something that feels new, as opposed to just handing something to somebody else. This assumes, thus, crafting is extremely popular. Everyone knows how to sew. Everyone knows how to do leather work and things along those lines. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so there's that concept of private property. It's not completely nailed down yet, but I like that concept. Now over here, we have this ranching with these large group of people living on shared ranches. So that's going to assume that property is a little more complicated. You're going to have more sort of communal ownership of property, but also in its own sense, a heightened sense of property, because you want that distinction between this is mine and this is what everyone else in the group owns. You want to have some sense of individuality within a commune. It's very hard to maintain complete communal ownership of things for a large populace. It can work for certain groups. There we go. But maybe this is a more communal world. So we will say, we'll put it up here. Let's say communal property is the norm. Most items are owned by the shared ranch, are owned used communally by all members of the shared ranch. Do we want to do some similar thing where if you own something, you have to mark it with your name or something, your personal mark? Maybe instead there's a sense of if I wear it, it's mine. If it is in this particular situation, it's mine. Except anything worn on a person. Exceptions are made for royalty, which use a particular color to indicate items of their possession. Maybe purple, the classic one, or yellow. We'll do yellow. So there's this particular shade of yellow, and you may not use that shade of yellow or a similar shade of yellow for clothing, unless you're a member of royalty. And if you're a member of royalty or on royal business, things along those lines, then you use that yellow. That yellow is used for royal processions, royal items, things along those lines. It's that symbol that this is a royal thing. That works. Now we also have a very technologically advanced society, which means a lot of items. So if you wear it, you own it. Although that may not necessarily be true. Except anything worn on a person, except clothing. Similarly, anything within a person's bedroom is owned by that person. Getting your own bedroom is a rite of passage, and essentially a sign of personhood. Exceptions are made for royalty. Indicate, we'll say royal items. Indicate royal items. We might extend this to other things. Maybe we do have crests. maybe we kind of flip that around. So there are kind of royal crests that are used only by groups to indicate possession of those things. Whereas in the other society, we use crests for individual, for possession. I don't know. We may have to think about that some more. But there's our concepts all translated into our settings. Sorry, having some slight problems clicking things around here. All right. Well, again, probably next week we will look back at all these things and try to integrate more of these a little bit more. Think about the consequences of each of these aspects. But we certainly have two very different settings, and two settings I quite like. This plentiful food world with a lot of hedge magic, a lot of simple ritual magic people are using a lot of the time, but it taxes the mind, it makes you mentally fuzzy. And this very strong sense of personal property, that everything you own has your own little mark on it. And you don't really, there's no concept of giving something of used things. If there's something you have that's used, you will still keep it until it's completely used up. You don't just give that to somebody else. Giving somebody something is a matter of giving them something new, something they can actually use fresh. Interesting. And then our world of steam engines and metal and ranching and communal property. That's interesting. Communal property combined with metallurgy. Because you're producing all of these objects. What does that mean? If communal property is known, that's also going to assume that companies and corporations are more communal. And magic is rare, powerful, erratic, and requires a familiar to channel things through. That'll be interesting. I wonder also how technology works into that. All right, that is it for this World Building Wednesday. Next time, we're going to come back and look at geography and settlements, i.e., what is the lay of your land physically, and also what does a village look like? What are its resources? What are its limitations? What does it need to survive? And what are some of the things you need to think about to make that a living and effective situation and place, rather than just, oh, people live here, but how could they live here, right? That's the plan for next time. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all next time. Until then, make more stuff.